Hello, welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at the 6 albums released by legendary punk icons The Clash. This is our first real serious foray into classic punk music, which was a seismic moment in the history and development of rock music. Loved by the youth, despised by parents, the DIY philosophy of making punk music belied and anger and frustration over important social issues that the best punk bands like The Clash, The Pistols, Susie and the Banshees, The Damned wrote about with an intelligence and a literacy that those horrified parents would actually, I think, have been quite impressed with if they'd bothered to listen in between the spitting, the swearing and all the safety pins. The Clash themselves formed in London in 1976. You had Joe Strummer and Mick Jones on guitar and vocals, Terry Chimes on drums and Paul Simonon on bass guitar. And I think of all the bands to emerge from London's punk scene, The Clash are now certainly the most revered because I think they were more deft and versatile musically than their peers. And they managed to break out of those punk chains and into the MTV mainstream with a slew of hit singles you still hear quite regularly on the radio today. Joe Strummer's sad early death has also sort of elevated him now to an iconic status befitting one of the country's greatest punk poets. And today he even has a stage at Glastonbury named after him. Just to give you one of those weird degrees of separation, my bathroom scales used to be owned by none other than Paul Simonon, but that is an entirely different story. But look, let's weigh up the Clash's albums, see what I did there, and see which ones are the heavyweights and which ones are a bit light on quality. And at number 6, I am going to put their 6th and final album from 1985, Cut the Crap. And any of you Clash fans out there will not be remotely surprised that this one is at the bottom. I mean, oh dear. I mean, where do you start? I mean, the first thing to ask is really, is this actually a Clash album? You've got no Topper Headon or Mick Jones on this album, both of whom had been fired by this point. Paul Simonon himself only plays on a few of the tracks, and it's really just Joe Strummer and a bunch of young punks and Norman Watt Roy from the Blockheads on quite a few of the bass, on the bass on quite a few of the tracks. You know, the biggest problem here is that the prodigal manager Bernie Rhodes has returned, and he is sharing not only songwriting credits with Joe Strummer, but the production duties. Now look, there's a reason managers take care of business, not music, and this album is a brilliant example of that. Really, it's simply unlistenable. If there are any decent tracks here, they're buried under a mess of 80s drum machines, bad mixes, bad production choices, and almost total lack of tunes. This is universally regarded as not only the worst Clash album, but also one of the very worst albums ever made by a major artist. I mean, please don't listen to this album. I mean, The Clash and Strummer particularly deserve far more than your time spent on this sorry mess. And of all the hundreds and hundreds of albums I've ever reviewed on Rock Records Reviewed, this was possibly the hardest to go back to and listen to. Part of it is actually quite painful. And indeed, within 2 weeks of this album coming out, Joe Strummer knew time was up and disbanded the band, knowing better than to flog a dead horse. Having said all that, it's probably made you want to go and listen to it, hasn't it? Trust me, it's not a pleasant experience. At number 5, I'm going to put their 4th album, Sandinista, from 1980. This was even more ambitious than the preceding album, London Calling, which was a double album, because this is a triple album, 36 songs. Strummer said it was the band's way of mocking CBS over their initial refusal to release London Calling as a double album, but in the same year they released Bruce Springsteen's The River as a double album. For the first time, all the songs were credited to the band as a whole, and it's a real potpourri of musical styles. You've got, I mean, it goes from punk through ska, through reggae, through pop, through jazz, through rhythm and blues, through calypso and folk. I mean, it's nuts, really. It is unfocused and it is sprawling. I mean, you've got backwards tracks, unfinished tracks, you've got unfulfilled ideas, you've got little girls singing songs. I mean, it's an epic and a monumental collection of ideas for sure. But that's what most of these are, just really ideas. They really did forget where the edit button was. frankly, I think it would have struggled to have made a decent double album even, and let alone a triple album. But I think you could have made a fairly good single album from this. You've got you've got really good tracks like The Magnificent Seven. You've got Somebody Got Murdered, Career Opportunities. There's also an army of additional musicians on here, most notably, again, Norman Watt Roy and Mickey Gallagher and Davey Payne from the Blockheads, Ian Dury's band. The album actually had quite good reviews, with many of the critics calling it the punk white album, but this album really has got very, very little to do with punk. There's barely a song on here that has the traditional straightforward punkish sound of their first album. And for me, I just find it's just too sprawling and diverse to digest properly. And number 4, from 1978, I'm going to put their second album, Give 'Em Enough Rope. This was actually their debut album in America, because their first album, The Clash, the release was delayed a couple of years in the States, and it marks the introduction of Topper Headon on drums, which sort of augments the classic Clash lineup. And the accepted wisdom here is that CBS brought in a fancy producer to tart up the band's sound, realizing they had some potential. So they brought in Sandy Permon from Blue Oyster Cult. And despite perhaps a bit more melody and a tougher sound and heavier guitars, sonically, for me, it kind of does seem to be unsure whether it's a punk album or a hard rock album. And I actually prefer the raw punch of the debut. I think it's still a good record. And there's still a lot of anger beneath the guitars. But Perlman crucially didn't like Joe Strummer's voice and mixed it very low in the final mix. And I think that's, you can't do that with punk. You need the personality and you need the voice out front, I think. Also, this is the album where the band's wider influences really properly start to show, particularly on something like the 50s stylings of Julie's Been Working for the Drug Squad. Lyrically, it's just as punchy as their debut, but there does seem to be more of a focus on an international news happening internationally with this. You've got songs about drug busts and terrorism and things like that. Tommy Gunn's Safe European Home, Stay Free are among the sort of better known tracks on this record. And it wasn't quite as well received as the first album. And for me, it does have an element of that difficult second album. But I think it is makes up the 4 go-to Clash albums, if not anywhere near the quality of the top 3. And let's get to the top 3 now. From 1982, in third place, I'm going to put their 5th album, Combat Rock. The band had a bit of a 2-year break, and this was the classic lineup's return. I think that the triple album Sandinista, with being so sort of bloated and sprawling, had kind of taken it out of them a little bit, and they decided to reinstate the manager Bernie Rhodes to recapture some of the leaner anger and chaos of the band's earlier albums. Now, this idea wasn't welcomed by everybody, particularly Mick Jones, and this was part of the start of his estrangement from the band. And in fact, this did become his last album he made with them. And it is a lean, stripped-back affair after the weighty doubles of London Calling and Sandinista. It's very focused on songs, and you've got things like Rock the Casbah, which made the band MTV stars. It also has Should I Stay or Should I Go? And I think those 2 songs have done as much to ensure the band's sort of more commercial legacy as anything. I mean, and indeed, Combat Rock is the band's best-selling album. It went double platinum in the USA, where it stayed on the charts for 61 weeks, peaked at number 2 in the UK, 7 in the USA. But behind all the success, there were deeper troubles. Topper Headon was, by this point, getting quite heavily into hard drugs, particularly heroin. And it proved to be his last album with the band as well. The band finished the album at Electric Ladyland Studios in New York, and they had enough material for a double album, which Mick Jones wanted to release. But he was argued down, again further escalating tensions between him and Joe Strummer. And the legendary Glenn Johns, I'm sure you all heard of, was brought in to redo Mick Jones's initial mix, and he did cut it down from a double album into a lean, mean single. Lyrically, a recurring theme on this album is America's involvement in Vietnam, and the band was very, very heavily influenced by the Francis Ford Coppola film Apocalypse Now, and in fact even on Sandinista there was a song called Charlie Don't Surf, which is of course a famous quote from that film. Reviews were mixed, with some critics saying the band was selling out, others saying they were stagnating, and there were some critics who thought they were evolving, and as ever I think the truth is kind of a mix of all three of those opinions, if that's possible. It is a mixed bag. You know, you've got Clash classics like Straight to Hell, Should I Stay or Should I Go, Rock the Casbah, alongside less likeable songs like Red Angel, Dragnet and Death is a Star. But, you know, that said, as a last hurrah of the classic lineup, I think it's undeniably an overall success. So, number 2, and I think these are the two real classics from 1977. In second place, I'm going to put their debut album, The Clash. After not too many gigs, the band was signed by CBS in the punk wave, and before too long they found themselves in the studio working on their debut, and the result was The Clash. It was a debut that was in many ways kind of overshadowed by Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols and all the furore around that record. But The Clash is intense, it's angry, but there's also a musicality here which is missing from many other punk bands' efforts. Mick Jones plays a tidy guitar, and Joe Strummer immediately staked his claim as the working man's lyricist, despite being something of a middle-class kid. It's tight and it's lean, and many of the tracks are barely 2 minutes long. Janie Jones, White Riot, London's Burning, Career Opportunities, Police and Thieves. Brilliant. I mean, the album is fast, it's furious, full of energy and testosterone, which is ironic considering that most of it was written in Mick Jones's grandmother's flat. It was recorded in 3 weeks, and the album's lyrics really set out the band's manifesto clearly. You know, dissatisfaction with the economy, race issues, Americanization, the class system, all topics the band would return to over and over again in their career. The fans and the critics loved it, and they loved how they felt the band was holding a mirror up to society and asking it to face the ugly truth of what it was becoming. And it was universally exalted as one of the most exciting and important records in rock history. Got to number 12 in the UK charts, and to this day I think it sounds as fresh as it ever did. Constantly makes all-time greatest albums lists. And I'd suggest if you were new to British punk and wanting to explore, you couldn't really do much better than this and Nevermind the Bollocks by the Pistols. A note though, this album did come out in 1979 in the USA with a slightly different track listing, but as always for these reviews I always go by the UK release. So in number 1 place from 1979, it's their third album. It's the iconic London Calling. The Clash had split from their manager Bernie Rhodes. They'd moved to new rehearsal studios, but they had writer's block. The songs weren't really coming. And they were in a bit of a strange place because they were really wanting to move away from the punk roots. They wanted to not to be lumped in with a lot of that kind of bother boy punk ideology. And they'd been touring the States and using acts like excuse me, like Bo Diddley and Screaming Jay Hawkins as supports, and they were falling back in love with traditional rock and roll. Like I said, ironically, this album came out after a period of writer's block for Strummer and Jones, but eventually with some discipline and band bonding, the songs started trickling, and then they started pouring in, and the result was London Calling, regarded by many as the greatest album ever made by a punk band. And this is not really a punk band, a punk album. As I go back to, you know, what I was saying about the influence of the rock and roll, it certainly takes the vitality and attitude of punk, but it mixes it with that rock and roll mythology and social commentary that they had become known for by this point. Some people have called it the first truly post-punk album, but more than ever, the Clash were beginning to explore a huge range of influences, and you know, those styles are all here because you can hear ska, reggae, jazz, pop. There's even a piano ballad on here. They were really unafraid to try anything. And this album is an epic feast of all of those styles. And few album openers are as absolutely iconic as London Calling, and then it goes straight into the fabulous brand new Cadillac. And along the way we get Lost in the Supermarket, Clamp Down, Guns of Brixton, Train in Vain. And having expanded their worldview and give them enough rope, this album again is kind of more focusing back on London, and what was happening in London at this time. Going back to the rock and roll influence, the cover again is a direct homage to Elvis Presley's self-titled debut album. And the result was a double album that sold 5 million copies. London Calling got into the top 20 in the UK, but I think that song's cultural legacy runs far, far deeper than that placing would suggest. It was named the best album of the 80s by Rolling Stone magazine, and it regularly sits near the top of too many greatest albums of all times lists to mention here. It's the 7th most highly acclaimed album of all time by acclaimedmusic.com, a site that collates all critics' reviews, which is a great little site if anyone likes that sort of thing. But it deservedly sits at the top here of my list of best Clash albums, I think. Aside from the albums, they did do a number of really great non-album singles, tracks like Armageddon Time and the fabulous Bank Robber, which is one of my favourite Clash songs, and you can usually find those on some of the band's compilations. The best one, I think, is perhaps The Story of the Clash Volume 1. They also did a very suitably exciting live album called Live at Shea Stadium when they were supporting The Who on a tour of North America. After the Clash, Mick Jones went on to form Big Audio Dynamite and released E equals MC Squared, which I think is one of the very greatest singles of the 80s. Strummer formed the Mescaleros, but then died in 2002 from an undiagnosed congenital heart disease at the tragically early age of 50. But I think his musical legacy with the Clash will, I think, forever remain a potent and powerful one, certainly as long as angry, intelligent people want to voice their opinions to the sound of a loud guitar. But that's my list of top 6 Clash albums. I am pretty certain every one of you will agree with me on what number 6 was, and I'd love to know if any of you go and listen to it after that review and tell me what you think. But the top 1, 2, 3 is fairly debatable. They're all great records, I think. But that's it for this week. I'll be back again very soon with another Rock Records review. So thank you for watching. Bye bye.